Most unlikely of villains, smooths of brain and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it boggle? Does it meow? In the lair of the cerebral bore, and will show him so much more. We'll leave your brains at the door.
Welcome back to Cerebrivore. My name is Jason. I host the Nerds RPG Variety Cast, and today our panel consists of old hat Arlen Walker of Live from Pelham's Wasteland, and a first-time guest on Cerebrivore, Che Webster of Roleplay Rescue. How are you doing today, gentlemen?
Yeah, I'm all good.
Yeah,
excellent, great. So, Che, I appreciate your taking time out to join us today. I know you're very busy and with time zones and all that. It's okay. We had the power of editing to fix that. But anyhow, today we Arlen came up with a subject that I think is really interesting, and it's a kind of the idea of not only nostalgia in gaming, but the idea of revival, where systems kind of get revived. So kind of going back and picking up old IPs and old systems and coming back. Like, for instance, and we don't necessarily need to talk about this one, although we can, but right now, I believe there's a Kickstarter for Space 1889 that's bringing it to 5e, and that's a system that's changed, been in a variety, there's a ubiquity version, the original Game Design Workshop version. I think there's a Savage Worlds version. So these games, this IP or the settings keep getting updated to other systems. So I guess we'll start with you, Che. Are there any games that you followed and that you enjoyed the setting so much that you've picked up all the various systems and kind of followed their lifespan as they've progressed?
Yeah, I think there are loads, but I think some of the ones that stand out for me are perhaps some of the ones that aren't as well known. So, for example, when the alternative role-playing game came out around about 1999, they produced a setting called Dark Matter. They also produced a science fiction setting. But Dark Matter was an absolutely awesome conspiracy horror setting. And then when the D20 system came out and the D20 Modern was eventually released, they did a sort of D20 Dark Matter. And obviously I collected that as well because I was really excited and think it's going to be awesome. It wasn't. And what is interesting is that setting and that game, especially the alternative game, the original game as well, has kind of keeps coming back. Like, no one's publishing for Dark Matter anymore. But, a few years ago, so I think about 2017, Kickstarter was done for Alternity. One of the games company has kind of taken on the IP of the idea of Alternity, because I think Wizards still retain the original, but they've taken the name, and the system is relatively similar, and kind of simple version of the original, and kind of bringing that back to life again. And then it's interesting that the settings that they created are remarkably similar to the ones that were originally published and stuff like that. And I get really excited by that. So I think every time you get this new incarnation, you get new designers, you get new kind of ideas around it. And what was particularly interesting for me with Alternity is that one of the original designers was involved in the remake. So it's kind of like one of those things where they keep coming back on these themes and trying to do new things with them. That's really exciting.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, there's there's so many like that out there when you think about it. Like I mentioned the Space 1889, but like Chill is another one that sadly we haven't seen a new version for a while there. But yeah, the original version from Pacesetter Limited, and then Mayfair Games came out with a second edition, which is kind of mechanically a little different, but kind of kept the same tone. And then there's a third edition that was Kickstarted that changed things up. But and we haven't really had anything since then. But that it's another interesting one. Arlen, are there any systems that you've kind of followed through different incarnations?
I don't know if there's anything that I've followed kind of for its complete lifespan, although I guess maybe something like the Riddle of Steel qualifies for me, because I've definitely the original, the very first publication of the Riddle of Steel was like a booklet that they only printed like 100 of and gave out at Gen Con one year apparently, and I've never seen that in person, of course. But the core book for the Driftwood kind of full version that they put out. And then obviously, so Driftwood Publishing doesn't exist anymore, as far as I know, or maybe it does technically, and it's just a holding for somebody, but who knows? Anyway, they're not publishing new books, but there are a number of games from people who were sort of inspired by that original game and have made kind of new things based on it. So you've got like Blade of the Iron Throne and Song of Swords and Sword and Scoundrel that all kind of have a sort of different take on a similar kind of core structure. And then you also have stuff like Codex Martialis, which is based on originally sort of D20 third edition SRD, and uses some kind of similar principles. There's a sort of roll and keep system that's a little bit like the rolling dice pools in Blade of the Iron Throne, but the main guy behind Codex Martialis actually wrote some of the stuff for the original Riddle of Steel, and I've talked to him, John Chandler, about kind of, some of the things that he wanted to put in the Riddle of Steel, and that ended up sort of coming into his ideas about what should be in Codex Martialis. And it definitely has, it's a fairly different mechanically in terms of, what your character sheet looks like and what you roll. But it definitely creates that kind of feel of, really intense, realistic historical combat. So.
And of course, there are some companies that seem to exist to do this. Right? I'm thinking about Précis Intermedia, for example, PIG Games, is it? PI Games, sorry. Who basically seem to dig out old games that everybody's forgotten about, or at least perhaps they fondly remember, but thought had gone, and revive that IP and put it back into print. And one of the ones for me was the Masterbook system
Masterbook,
that they've done. Yeah, really bringing that back, which is something I really loved back in the day. I'm not sure why, but I did. Torg and was based on that, and several other kind of key IPs. And I think by bringing that back and putting it out there, that was really exciting to see. And of course, the fans of that can use it, but also new people can discover it. I think it's awesome. So yeah, there are. My point as well. There are some companies that exist pretty much to do this.
Oh, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize. I didn't mean to cut you off there. 100%. In fact, I also love the Masterbook system. I have a ton of Masterbook games. Torg is the one I haven't collected, but I have Necroscope. I have, the World of Tales from the Crypt, World of Indiana Jones, the World Tank Girl. I have another one too. I don't remember what the other. Anyway, but I've got a whole bunch of those oddball. Oh, the World of Species, because the movie Species. I mean, of course you're gonna make a RPG out of that, right? But no, Masterbooks are interesting. So did you ever get to play? So did you play Torg back in the day?
Yeah, we played a little bit. I've not so much Torg. I did play a bit of it. I was my friend, Rev Derek, right?
Yeah.
He's a massive fan of Torg, so he got me into that when we were at uni together. But yeah, I played a bit of Masterbook, and it's the decks, isn't it? I really enjoyed the one for me. I think it's based. Yeah, it's Shatterzone. That was the game I got into big time. I remember that getting Shatterzone. I didn't realize it was part of a sort of a bigger system actually at the time, but I just got into that. I really liked that science fiction setting, sort of out on the fringe of space, kind of all these crazy stuff going on. Sort of trying to. There's a combination of a sort of a space post-apocalypse thing going on with aliens and weird stuff going on in there. It's great. Anyway, loved that game, and so that led me into the sort of the system.
Right, and PIG is reselling Scatterzone. You can buy that now, both the Masterbook edition, and there is a edition that doesn't use the Masterbook decks. Mm-hmm. So yeah,
well, obviously the right one is the Masterbook version.
Of course.
But this is how sad I am with Masterbook though. When that got published by PI Games, I ordered the deck, like the Masterbook decks, because they were actually like gold dust back in the day anyway to get hold of them. And yeah, to have that shipped from US to UK, don't tell you, that was a little bit of expense, but I've got it. I can play it anytime.
Yeah, I was lucky. I picked it in some of the games I have. I've got the original Masterbook decks, which I probably should buy new ones because they're getting old now. But yeah, it's really interesting. So, and that's so in 20 years from now, and we're kind of jumping ahead here with the nostalgia thing, but a lot of these games now, so Master Deck is an interesting idea because you did have that proprietary deck system. And now we have so many games that have proprietary dice. I'm thinking like these 2D20 games. I'm thinking, or not 2D20 as much. I'm sorry, as the FFG games, Star Wars, but even the 2D20, like the Conan. I know like the Conan dice are hard to find.
Well, and the 2D20, they do regular D20s for the task resolution, but they do often they call them like action dice or combat dice, which are 6-siders. But they're not, you don't just read the number, and they make special 6-siders that are for that. But it's a 1 is 1 point, a 2 is 2 points, a 3 and a 4 are 0 points, and a 5 or a 6 are a 1 point plus a special effect. And so it's kind of obviously you can use, right? You can buy special dice from Modiphius if you want. They make, the Star Trek dice that you could have like each person who's playing a member of a certain crew on the ship, right? That, whoever's part of engineering has the engineering dice, and whoever's part of science has the science dice. And if you wanted to do that, that could be a fun,
Yeah, which is great. Oh, go ahead, Trey.
I was going to say also you got all the free Illegan games. You think about those, those special dice decks, and with the One Ring as well. And the second editions are really nice.
And I think that's what I see more commonly is less like kind of totally custom dice, right? It's fairly regular to have like a Kickstarter where it's like, oh, if you roll, a nat 20 on your die, it's got a special, symbol on it. That sort of thing seems common enough. And I guess you have things like the One Ring dice have their kind of funkiness because they use D12s and D6s, but there's sort of special symbols. The D12 is 1 through 10, and then an Eye of Sauron and a Gandalf G rune. So it's kind of funky. But I think more often what I see nowadays is like having almost like a sort of like prop card deck sort of thing. So like you'd have, instead of having like a, random table in the book with, here's all of these like different magical items, that you might have just like, the box set from Free League comes with a deck of like, 40 treasure cards, and you just shuffle them up and hand them out in play. And so it's a sort of tactile version of, it's sort of the same thing as rolling on a random table, but you get card and you get art, and oftentimes it has like the specific, like if it's treasure, it might have the specific information for it. So you just hand it to the player and they know what it does immediately, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And, Cthulhu Confidential, they do that with that, where they've got decks of cards that are specifically built for each challenge. They have special cards for the challenge. They're actually those, so you don't use those as, they're more a handout to the player as a result of that challenge or whatever, but they want you to have specific cards for the challenges, which is kind of interesting. I guess where I was going with the dice is we're talking about nostalgia and games getting brought forward, but a lot of these are IP based games. They're licensed properties, and a lot of times once that license is gone, they lose the right to sell that game anymore. So sadly, a lot of these things like the special dice for now FFG effectively has kept the Star Wars license, or not FG, but I guess Asmodeus, right? It still has the Star Wars license. It goes to Edge.
They've got the original Star Wars stuff, but then they've also got the Genesis system that is kind of all of basically the same mechanical structure, but without any Star Wars stuff in it. And I don't know how much the Star Wars stuff is odd, because also they legally weren't allowed to sell PDFs for whatever reason. There was something to do with digital distribution. So I don't know how much kind of the FFG Star Wars is still being printed and sold. And I've got a number of the books for that, but I haven't played it in a while. But I know Genesis is still around, and those dice are totally compatible. They just have, a slightly different symbol. So if you want to, but it is kind of an odd, and they did I guess it's Edge through Asmodee from Fantasy Flight. They were talking about because for the newest edition of Legend of the Five Rings, they did something kind of similar where it has the Legend of the Five Rings roll and keep some of what you roll, but the dice all have funky symbols on them, like the kind of newer, like the Star Wars game, or even like Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition. But I get the sense that game is not doing very well, because they recently announced that a bunch of their smaller products are going to be PDF only, because it doesn't make any sense for them to print them, which seems like an obvious sign that they're just not moving as many physical copies of things as they would hope to. So yeah, I guess we'll see.
Yeah, which is kind of sad. You mentioned Warhammer. So Warhammer is an interesting property too. in that it's gone through a number of different evolutions, and then in the latest one, of course, they've kind of fallen back on the feel of the original. They've added some complexity to second edition with fourth edition, but they've kind of gone back to the original after FFG's. What FFG's version was a lot like was the prototype for what became Genesis and Star Wars.
Yeah. Well, and Warhammer Fantasy RPG fourth edition by Cubicle 7 really brought you back to D percentile rolls. It went back to the sort of original core attributes that were from the miniature war game. So you have Games Workshop isn't publishing Warhammer Fantasy Battles anymore. But I guess if you wanted to play like a 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battles battle with your 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy RPG characters and just use the conversion notes from like 1st or 2nd edition, you probably could. I think the biggest things that they changed for 4th edition, there's a couple of kind of tinkering that's, I think, designed to make you have less kind of whiffy combat. So the advantage system basically is that, the idea being that you get an advantage even if you didn't necessarily, hit them very hard or anything. And I think that's sort of the idea. They also, I think the other biggest change is they changed the way that the careers work so that you don't have to switch to a new career all the time. And that a lot of what like in 2nd edition would have, like, so you'd have like the Bretonnian, Knight Errant into Knight of the Realm, into Questing Knight, into Grail Knight. You might just have one career of Bretonnian Knight and just like 4 tiers within it, which is kind of an interesting change. I think it's odd because I think some people really like it because they're like, oh, I just want to play through, the track and do all that. And some people are like, no, now it's, I don't get all the kind of special flavor of going to something weird that I didn't expect to go to because of circumstances. But then you also have, to talk about kind of revivalist games, you have, I don't know if either of you guys have seen Warlock. Is a system that mechanically is more based on advanced fighting fantasy, although it also takes some inspiration from Warhammer Fantasy RPG, and is designed. It has a lot of kind of implied setting that's very similar to the Warhammer Old World, and so you could play your Warhammer First Edition adventures with it pretty easily. But that's the thing that kind of really interests me because it's its own kind of new creation that is really trying to capture the feel of those older games. And that's something, I mean, it's kind of similar to Torchbearer from Burning Wheel, where you're using the mechanics that basically come from Mouse Guard, which comes from Burning Wheel itself, to create a game that is designed to feel like tournament play BX back in the day, essentially, which is kind of an interesting idea to me always.
Yeah, there's a sort of iterative process that goes on here, isn't there? That's really interesting, and how different creators riff off of stuff as well. So it's not just talking about like bringing back a particular IP or a particular game system, but it's also about like how that thing influences the next thing, which influences the next thing, which kind of like it's always harping back, always diving back to those roots, probably where somebody started in their hobby and they have that nostalgia for it, and they're just kind of updating that. And there's something a bit clunky about that, so I'll do it a bit more like this, and there's that. So I guess we've got 3 streams going already, because we're talking about a nostalgia and a repetition of IPs. And we've only just touched on a few, but biggies are like Star Wars and the Lord of the Rings, or Middle Earth, and you've got like as you were talking about there with Warhammer, they're just 3, and then you've got game systems that kind of get reimagined and brought back and sort of and taken forward, and then we've got this kind of iterative process of like I'm harping back to something experience I had, but I want to do it in a slightly different way.
Definitely. And all these kind of touch a little bit on that nostalgia bit, because you're trying to reach back, but they're very different than games like, and this isn't a slight on those games, but games like, say, Traveler, where if you played Traveler back in the day, there are ways you can still be playing that right now that it's effectively the same game. or Palladium games. They haven't really changed much at all since the 80s, right? It's the same thing. They're including the same layout, and, which isn't always a good thing for the book layout, right? But so, yeah, it's interesting. Some things haven't changed, and the fan base is very happy with that not changing. But other games definitely have, and we see, especially with the OSR movement and with some of these other movements out there, trying to capture the feel of those older games, but with new mechanics. So
and then you also have kind of another sort of twist on that, which is certain properties that either have had not a whole lot of licensing, or the licensed game hasn't been very well received, or things like that, where even with Star Wars, where the Star Wars games tend to be pretty well liked, you have all sorts of, here's how to do Star Wars in Savage Worlds, here's how to do Star Wars in Fate, here's how to do, which is, I think, a really interesting thing too, because you can sort of see the ways that people identify different things about that kind of original franchise that they really like and that they want to bring to the table, and how to bring that to the table in the space of a different. There's a Star Wars hack for Burning Wheel, which I think is really interesting, because it really, there's some really great discussion specifically about, because it's based on the original trilogy specifically, but there's some great discussion about like the lightsaber duels in the original trilogy and how to model those in Burning Wheel, and why the duel between Luke and Vader in The Empire Strikes Back ought to be a combat, but the duel between Luke and Vader in Return of the Jedi, or between Obi-Wan and Vader in A New Hope, ought to be a duel of wits, is the term that they use for basically a discussion. And so there happens to be lightsaber swinging, but it's really the characters trying to convince each other to do what they want. And that, in Return of the Jedi, Vader is basically trying to convince Luke to hit him with the lightsaber, and is able to win the contest by mentioning Leia, and that's how you should model, which is, I think, a really interesting way both to think about the original material and to think about how to kind of create these fun gaming experiences.
I think the other thing to sort of touch on as well is that some games have gone through this iterative process because of legal and kind of company-based things. Like Traveler's a good example of that, really. GW puts out the game and then eventually collapses as a company. Mark Miller picks it up, the license, does Traveler 4, thinks he's improving the game, does an entire new section of the milieu, creates the sort of year zero milieu, which is right back to the beginning of the third Imperium. And then that kind of goes, his company kind of falls over or doesn't get that going. So then, they start bringing back the old products and kind of getting it out there. As we get through the open gaming license and stuff, then other people pick it up and start mucking about with it and doing their own thing. We have all of these kind of retro clones of that Traveler game. I mean, it's amazing. And it's the bit that Mark Miller has is the IP of the Traveler universe, the official Traveler universe, and yeah, it's such a diversely managed and fan run thing, really. That you go to traveler.net, you're going to get the map of the entire universe with all the stats and everything, and it's run by fans, really. I find all of that fascinating as well. How there's a tension between the business bit and the fan community bit that kind of keeps a game alive.
There are definitely a number of games that have been kept alive due to the fans, right? There's no so both Marvel Superheroes, TSR's Marvel Superheroes, and the DC Heroes game both come to mind. Again, I believe Mayfair, right? I believe Mayfair was coming to DC Heroes, but because you can find fan sites for both those games that have, new rule editions, fan-made rule books, stats so you can find from like their stats for the DC Heroes and the Marvel Heroes, everybody you can think of, from Carl Kolchak, the Night Stalker, to, Marvel stats for Marvel Heroes in the DC game and stats for DC Heroes in the Marvel game, but fans have kept these things alive since the 80s. It's.
I want to bring up the elephant in the room. I just want to talk about D&D for a second, actually.
Yeah.
Because this has gone through this process, right? It's iterative process where we all assume it's making progress to becoming a better game, and also, its properties, like the properties that Wizards own, they're all being revived right now. And I think it's really interesting that, is that cynical marketing? I'm not sure, actually. I think that sometimes this is like the same thing, this desire. I was thinking about when they bring out Dragonlance, I was getting quite excited because I'm a big fan of that particular property. And And so, you sort of, the books are coming, and getting all excited about it for the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Is this the same kind of thing?
I don't know. Is it the same thing if it's within the same company? So I guess Warhammer kind of falls within that too, right? The recycling properties. So now I haven't read the new Dragonlance books. I think one of our other frequent host, BJ, the Arcane Alienist, I think he said he's read one or two of the new books, and he said they're pretty good. So hopefully they're going to be good. And I like to think that Wizards is not, people, obviously there are differing opinions depending what edition of the game you came in loving and your feelings. But I definitely don't think Wizards is trying to do anything wrong. I think they're trying to bring out good products, and they're like this last version of Gamma World that came out when the 4th edition D&D came out. I guess it'd be like the 7th edition of Gamma World. Well, it was actually kind of fun to play. It wasn't a bad game, for what it was. I mean, I kind of prefer 2nd edition, but that's because that's what I grew up with, right? But yeah, and TSR, I'll throw it to you just 1 second, Arlen. Sorry. TSR has so many WotC has so many interesting properties they got from TSR. From Star Frontiers, which has some unfortunate recent legal battles, but really Star Frontiers is a neat IP that definitely they could bring back and do something with if they wanted to Boot Hill, there's a number of things they own. Unfortunately, some of the more interesting properties they have, like Top Secret and like Gangbusters, they don't really own anymore. So they can't really publish those. But yeah, it is interesting. I don't know as far as going back in the well, but go ahead, Arlen.
Well, it's interesting to bring up 4th edition D&D because to some degree, I mean, I think a lot of people associate this kind of revival of all this old stuff with 5th edition, but 4th edition did not, I think, quite as much of that. And because they published a lot more kind of raw rule books, because they were like, oh, players only buy the player's handbook, so let's make 3 of them. It's not as kind of obvious out of the total, number of books. Whereas for 5th edition, because they've tried to keep the publishing a lot more limited, it seems like a much bigger part of it. But they did some of that too. And I think that's a really interesting, like 4th edition Dark Sun is kind of a really interesting concept because 4th edition totally leans into a different kind of flavor of gameplay to like 2nd edition Dark Sun that you had originally, which is not to say that you couldn't do something interesting with it, but the idea of like, the struggle to survive in a hostile wasteland is not really something that 4th edition leans into as much. But it does lean into the kind of like high action, sword and sorcery excitement stuff that you could totally do with that. And it's kind of an interesting thing. I also think I think there's something to be said for having kind of a baseline of a lot of that stuff, for lack of a better term. The idea that, if all of the properties get brought back for 5th edition or for D&D Beyond or whatever they're calling the new D&D Next. No, D&D Next was the last one.
Yeah, it's one D&D, I think.
One D&D, yes, yeah. That's what I'm thinking of. But the idea of having kind of, here's like a sort of another baseline for all of these different properties that have existed in different iterations in different editions, but gives you sort of a good way, especially if you like that system, to kind of look at that and say, okay, well, I can, pretty easily draw from all of these different things, which I do think is arguably the biggest strength of 5th edition in general, is that because it is so popular and because the OGL is relatively right, 4th edition, they didn't do all the kind of third-party OGL stuff, and so there's basically just Wizards and then people on forums and stuff like that. But for 5th edition, because you can make money doing it, there's some really good products that have come out of other people's interpretations of 5th edition. Here's a set of new classes, here's a set of new spells, or you even have like Beowulf 5e from Handiwork Games is one that I like to bring up, that is uses a lot of the sort of core game concepts of 5e, but in a very different way, because you have the expectation of one hero who has kind of a posse of buddies who can help you out in different times, but that you're one hero and you're generally doing a kind of 2-part, investigate what is going wrong and then deal with what is going wrong. And you've got some kind of interesting like random tables to try to build that structure into the gameplay and stuff like that. But I think that's kind of, to me, that's the biggest kind of benefit of having a lot of this sort of revivalist stuff, is that, if you like that system, it's so easy to have, you've got all of these different versions of things. Now, the trade-off is, I think, people talk about like, trying to run games for Adventurers League, and they're like, oh yeah, so I want a fairly kind of low fantasy game. And everybody's like, well, I want to play this, special bird person race because they get these cool bonuses. I think some of that response is overstated, which is to say, I think if you're the GM, you just have to, be a big boy and say, no, that's not going to be okay, or yes, that is going to be okay. And it's not really fair to complain about players asking for things, which seems like a lot of it is people complaining that players even want to try these things rather than complaining about the player's response to them saying no. Because almost all the stories I hear, the end result is the GM says, no, that's not going to fly. And the player either says, okay, well, I don't know if this is the game for me, or okay, well, then I'll pick something else. But that's kind of another side discussion. But I do think there's a lot of, it's cool when you have that kind of, breadth of things available to, build your game out of, and especially, if you wanted to do, since they've got all the kind of multiversal stuff with Magic, you could totally have a game in 5th edition D&D that moves between a bunch of these different settings and, plays around with that.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what they do, because they've done Spelljammer, and of course the Spelljammer that's come out, it's a little bit closer to Planescape. It's almost like they're kind of combining the two a little bit, and that was kind of Planescape to some degree, where you could go to any of these worlds, right? In a large way. So and with multiversal being a tagline these days, and everybody, from the Marvel movies to other movies, or getting into that, TV shows get into it, so that's in the public knowledge now, the idea of parallel worlds, it has been for decades, but it's really big right now. So for them to kind of dive into that probably would be smart, and I'm surprised we haven't actually seen them tap into that a little bit more already.
I'll pick up a little bit on the nostalgia as well. So it's 20 years, right, or 22 years or so since Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition was launched in 2000. And I kind of think like there's probably a whole bunch of people out there for whom that was their entry. And now, there's a nostalgia for the stuff that was done back then. So an example might be Tolos, which, Monty Cook produced. There was a massive tome back in the early 2000s, and of course now through his own company Monty Cook Games, he's done a 5th edition version of that, and also a version of that for his Cypher system. And again, it's a sort of revisiting an IP and a world and putting it out there for a whole new bunch of people to explore. And I think there's a bit of that going on as well now, that is kind of the hankering back, the nostalgia is, they're not all as old as us, so the nostalgia is, back to that experience, that through that 2000s period, 2008. And I think that's really interesting as well, because I was just actually yesterday thinking about all of the games that came out through the D20 boom and all of the settings and stuff that were created, and sort of thinking about some of those have made it through and continued through, and many haven't, obviously. But there are so many great games that were produced and so many great settings that were produced that it actually is worth going. Even if you're not a fan of 3rd edition, it's well worth looking back through the back catalogue on Drive-Thru or whatever and seeing what's out there, because there's amazing stuff.
Right, definitely. And so they've had some of those that have been updated. There's what's the D&D edition or setting where it's like an Eternal Night. It's like Evernight or Eternal, or there's that was just recently within the last couple of years redone for 5th edition. The 3rd edition setting was like where the world's in darkness, but it's still the fantasy setting. And I know a lot of people were really excited for that to come back. So I kind of missed the D20 boom personally, but I can definitely see where that's a big thing. And there is so much out there for that D20 stuff that you would hope it would come forward. Yeah. So
there's some interesting, like I was thinking, Green Ronin did a lot of 3rd edition stuff, but then they also have, I don't know how much of it they have updated, but they definitely updated some of it. So like some of the Freeport stuff has been updated. There's a Fantasy Age version of their 3rd edition Trojan War book now, which is kind of a cool thing. I mean, you got to play Green Ronin's Fantasy Age to play that, but that's their fantasy game system, so it makes sense that they would update it there. And I think there's I think that it's an interesting it's kind of an odd thing in some ways, because I think there's some really cool things that you can see bits and pieces of how they got brought to the modern, but often didn't necessarily take like all of it. Thinking about, there's a third edition sort of alternate game called Iron Heroes that I think is really cool, that is built around a kind of more sort of like sword and sorcery focus. There's a one class that does magic, and they're a sort of alternate optional class, so you're allowed to not have any magic casters, but then you have a whole kind of structure, so like almost all the classes have some type of like a pool that they build up when they do things. So like the archer gets these essentially like pool tokens for aiming, and then can spend them to do cool stuff with shooting bows. And then you have the big heavy tank guy gets a pool every time he tanks a hit, and then can do cool stuff with that. And so it's a really interesting way to try to bring a lot of kind of dynamism to the martial side of play. And you have elements of that have come through in the newer games, a couple places, certainly in vanilla 5e, that have that, and also plenty of people that I think have been inspired by those ideas to do some of their own things. But it's kind of an odd thing that to me there's some bits of that have not really kind of fully been realized in a more modern sphere, and so it would be neat to see what somebody would do with a system like that, where you have that kind of like fluctuating up and down, because I really like those sorts of fluctuating up and down meta currencies that you build up your resources and then spend them down, and build up and spend down, because I think that's a fun mechanic. But
it's definitely interesting. And with this, where somebody really enjoys something, has that nostalgia from the past, but wants to update it, it's interesting to see how people react to it. How some people are willing. Like, look at like BX Gangbusters. That's a really interesting, because the original Gangbusters was a D percentile system, and then BX Gangbusters obviously is based on BX. And which is really interesting, because then for armor class, it's things like, well, the fancier you dress, the higher or the better your armor class is, kind of thing, right? But which kind of,
there's thinking about like, so it's Ad Infinitum, who does Icons, which is a superhero game that is sort of mechanically a blend of Fate and the old Marvel superheroes, because it uses die resolution that's a lot like Fate, and you have kind of aspects and stuff, but a lot of the basically all the attributes are pretty much exactly the same as the old Marvel superheroes game, just ported over into this system. But that's a really interesting game that I think works really, really well, and is a real great kind of demonstration of what you can do by sort of taking these different otherwise disparate elements to try to create something. Because the original Marvel superheroes, I think there's a lot of nostalgia for it, but there are also some things that are people have pointed out, right, that like your chance of hitting is totally uninfluenced by your opponent's abilities in general, and that therefore the idea being, okay, well, but why can't you like parry and block or dodge or any of that sort of stuff that is things that have sort of gone on with that. And that was apparently a big thing with DC heroes versus the old Marvel superheroes. The DC heroes, because a lot of the combat rules are contested, they were like, oh, you can actually dodge attacks in this one, and as opposed to just having a tank attacks basically, which is kind of a funny thing,
right? Well, and it's we mentioned Palladium earlier. That was one of the neat things with not just Palladium, but also Rolemaster, which I guess we should talk about Rolemaster in this discussion too. But Palladium and Rolemaster both, you can change your defense and do kind of active defenses. In Palladium, you have parries and you have dodges against attacks. So you can do, you can burn up, you have X number of actions a turn. So you can use some of those to do active defenses. Where in Rolemaster, you can adjust how much effort you're going to put into offense versus defense in a round. which is kind of interesting. But so let's talk about Rolemaster for a minute, because we talk about these systems kind of morph and change and definitely depend on the nostalgia of the fan base. And they've just released, at time of recording, Rolemaster Unlimited, or I'm sorry, Rolemaster what's
Unified.
Right? Unified. Thank you. Sorry, my brain's sponged to they're not working today. But
and that terminology is it in itself tells us something, right? Because it's the attempt to unify what's now known as Rolemaster Classic, which is the second edition of Rolemaster, sort of republished, and then what was the Rolemaster Standard System, and then it became the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing Game as it was sort of tweaked around about the end of the 90s, I think, mid to end of 90s. And there's two groups of Rolemaster players who love both of those two, the latter being way more crunchy and detailed than the former, but the former being I suppose a little bit slicker and faster in some ways, but also not as complete and not as detailed and nowhere near as sort of simulationist, I suppose. And here we have, Iron Crown has been resurrected by and sort of they're over a long period of time, because I was playing this like 7 years ago in a playtest. So it has really worked on bringing together those two editions to try and put out a new product which hopes to appeal to both groups. And perhaps to some new people, and I think that's a fascinating attempt. And I'm rather cynical. I rather think that might fail, simply because I think if you're playing Classic or you're playing RMR FRP, then you're probably going to be playing that forever. And yet. This is an attempt to bring it together and do something with it. And I have to say, it is worth a look if you are a Rolemaster fan, because it is doing some really interesting things.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's so I haven't had a chance to read through the new book yet. The core book is out. Spell Law is promised to us soon, but then we're still waiting, of course, for the monster book and the treasure book, which I think they're still sourcing the art for the monster book. So I don't know. It probably won't be really soon, but which is kind of I don't know. I kind of wish for the core book you had so there's a bunch of different ancestries or species, or I think, do they still use the term race in Rolemaster?
Yeah, it's race.
Yeah, they still use race, but you have a ton of different options of all kinds of different things. So if you like playing weird races in Rolemaster, maybe your game, the new one. But I kind of wish they'd put less of that in there, put like 20 monsters in there, put some spell stuff in there, put some treasure stuff in there. So Rolemaster Core would have really been a core you could have, that is somebody new to the game that doesn't have any of this other stuff could have just picked up and run the game, and then expanded it with the other books.
And I think that kind of speaks to who its target market is right now. It's been released for people who probably have been part of the Rolemaster forums for a long while and probably got involved in the playtest, and like me, have all those documents sitting around they can just pick up and play with, right? And it's being released into that marketplace where, people I'll probably be happy with that. I can kind of fudge, because it is a blend as well. You could fudge some stats from out of other things and that you've already got, but that indicates that maybe it's being targeted at that Rolemaster fan base. Whereas it's an opportunity for them as well to really kind of reach out and see if they can interest some different people too, which they won't do until the game's complete.
Right, which is different than what Steve Jackson Games has done, like with GURPS Dungeon Fantasy. Where GURPS Dungeon Fantasy, was reaching out, trying to get the fantasy. I mean, obviously, it's there. Well, you like GURPS and you like D&D, or here we're going to mash them together. But it also is designed for people that haven't played GURPS before, is a gateway in to some degree. I don't know. Would you agree with that, Trey? You have more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's a way of. So GURPS is such an open game, and you can take in so many different ways. So what it's doing is it's saying, here's a way of doing dungeon-based fantasy gaming. Here's how we would do it. And it's been actually calibrated against sort of the expectations we have these days for playing in like a computer style game level of power. Do you know what I mean? There are really high power characters in that. And that sort of fits with to some degree with the way D&D has sort of gone over the years as well. Like characters are very, very capable, lots of amazing abilities and stuff like that. So it's emulating that for you and doing that in a particular way. And then there's a bit of here's the dials to fiddle with if you want to, but if you really want to go and do your own fantasy game in your own way, well, we've got the basic set over here. Come and play with that, and all of these supplements, all 50 of them or something. So it absolutely is like trying to be a gateway. I think its actual market is people who played GURPS for years and like playing like D&D style games and just went, oh, that's cool, they've done it for us, hooray.
Mm-hmm. Right. As opposed to, like, you have so Palladium, I know we keep coming back to that, but I've got...
You do.
Well, you also... Yeah, I do. But you also like Palladium there. Okay?
I do.
But so Palladium's done something interesting, and they've licensed some of their properties, Rifts, and some things available Rifts to Savage Worlds. So you have Savage Rifts. And Palladium suffers from kickback from fans, from some people that are turned off by the rule set and turned off by some of the things in the books. But Savage Rifts, the Savage Worlds version of Rifts, is actually kind of designed directly at those people. Say, hey, you always want to play Rifts, but you don't like the Palladium system? Here you go. And probably to some degree, the Savage, they've done that with Pathfinder as well. Savage Pathfinder. And I, of course, I don't know what the sales numbers for these things are. I mean, you can see how good their Kickstarters did, but I don't know how sales have done after the Kickstarters. But
and to say, like, Savage Pathfinder, is that not harping back to the D20 boom, development of Pathfinder at the collapse of 3.5? Pathfinder and those two things sat alongside each other. Then Pathfinder went on and became, for a while, the most popular role-playing game until the 5th edition. So, it is interesting that, people who are really into Galarian as a world, and because that's what that is really, it's Savage Galarian, but we're using the Pathfinder logo and that name because it's high visibility and recognition from a marketing perspective. But again, it's a nostalgia to a world that has been created, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and is already kind of opening up to a whole new market of people who are playing Savage Worlds.
Right. So yeah, it's really interesting to see where the market's going to go from here. We have one D&D, and I don't want to get into idle speculation. We'll find out what Wizards' plans are when they do it. I can't, all the speculation about, oh well, the third party market's going away, and I just don't see that happening. To be honest, I don't see any realistic way it could happen, even if they wanted it to happen. But it's really interesting to see where the industry's going. You have Free League, so they were mentioned earlier, and they've been gobbling up, and Modiphius as well. Free League and Modiphius both been doing all kinds of licensed properties. So they grab it, they'll put out books, and then once they put out enough output, then they'll let it go. So like Mutant Chronicles, they picked up, put out their stuff, and now they moved on past it. Same thing with Conan. Because they didn't lose the license for Conan, they let it go. They chose not to renew it. Well,
although that's that's kind of a complicated, right? Not choosing not to renew it is not quite the same as losing it, but it also is a classic, right? That whoever owns the license thinks that it's worth more than whoever is going to buy. I mean, it seems like that's pretty much exactly what happened with Cubicle 7 and the One Ring, because they basically were ready to go with One Ring second edition, their version of One Ring second edition. And then that was when the license was up for renewal, and that they decided that it wasn't worth it, which is, it's a complicated, obviously everybody involved, the license holder wants to make money off of their license, and the people who are making the licensed product want to figure out how to, how much is the license worth versus all the other costs considered. But it is an interesting,
Yeah, I mean, to develop that is also one of the sad things I've noticed over my 40 years of gaming is the vulnerability that IP has, to that as well. So, you kind of get into a game based on a particular popular IP. So if you're talking about movie and TV stuff, especially, this is true. Again, it's something. And then, of course, the license goes away and the game goes often into a sort of hiatus for quite a long while often. And, we all love the new thing, don't we? So playing the old game that we've had for ages, we could do that, but we don't necessarily tend to. And people, it's hard to find a group around something very specific as well sometimes. And so that can be difficult. element in this. But the other half of that is the marketplace. So if the IP has suddenly had a resurgence, then it's in the interests of the IP holder to license out a new game, and that can be really exciting. And the flip side of that, it's really, really exciting, and you've seen this with Star Wars, you've seen this with Star Trek, we've seen it with so many different Lord of the Rings, so many different IPs over the years where they kind of have this a flowering and a real a golden age, if you like, of a game, and then it goes away for a bit and then it comes back, and that's I guess it adds the spice to the hobby. But you have to be aware, I think, when you're buying into something that's a big IP, that it might have a limited life. It probably will have a limited life, and I think as a gamer, one of the biggest reasons to go collect everything for that edition would be this. So if it's a high level IP, get in there and get the stuff, because you don't know how long it'll last for, has always been one of my fears anyway. And I think that can pay off, because then you can play, as I do, all 5 versions of the Star Trek role-playing game.
Well, I think that's for me the biggest kind of disappointment associated with it is not just when it goes away, but when it seems clear that without the kind of legal structure of licensing, that the game had more in it essentially when it went away. So I mean, Modiphius has talked about they're not going to publish anything new for Conan 2D20, and they had I don't know, it had at least one more book that was planned that was going to be specifically about the Picts in the Howardian Age, that they said, nope, we're not going to be able to do that. And seems like they were pretty, clear on the pipeline, because at least in some of the third wave books, they talked about having that, you'll have to wait for this book to get this information. And it's unfortunate that it seems like, as opposed to right with something like, say, Octan Cthulhu, that they directly own themselves, surely they won't, unless they run out of money to keep making books, they won't get into the point of oh well, the license is going away, so we can't finish. Or with the One Ring, there were a number of planned books that Cubicle 7 had talked about doing after second edition came out, that were supposed to be kind of broadly compatible with first and second, especially kind of region books and adventure books like they had been doing with first edition, to kind of expand the world even further. So they had talked about doing a region book and an adventure book for Gondor. That the idea was that the region book would be Gondor, because they had a Rohan region book, but they didn't have a Gondor one. So add some stuff for Gondor. And then the adventures would be young Aragorn when he's on his kind of adventures fighting against the pirates from Umbar and things like that. And it would, while it was called Errantries of the King, so it was pretty clear what was going on in the period and the setting. And then they had, I know they had talked about, because Decipher's version of the Lord of the Rings role-playing game had a really well-received Moria box set, and that Free League wanted to do a really kind of big, kind of almost like a Mega Dungeon book box set thing for Moria, that you would have, like Barrowmaze or Gillespie's Mega Dungeons, a kind of huge amount of material just for this one site. And so you could, go there with Balin's expedition and adventure in these, the original Mega Dungeon, right? Because it's sort of where that idea comes from in some ways. And obviously all of that. Free League may well want to do things like that as well with the license, and I haven't paid as much attention to what they've been planning for One Ring second edition, although I know they're more centered in kind of Eriador and the area of Arnor than the kind of Eastern Middle Earth like first edition was. But anyway.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting with this, when we saw the move from Cubicle 7 to Free League with the Lord of the Rings license, was they kept the One Ring, so they're largely compatible. There's some differences between first and second edition, but it's where normally they're not. Normally that's not the case. Normally it's a totally new game system. From what we can tell from the press releases so far, Monolith, who is going to get the Conan license, isn't going to keep the 2D20 system. They're probably going to be using the Batman system, which is based off D&D third edition. And right. So it's going to, now that's not for sure, but chances are it's not going to be a 2D20 based game. Normally they don't continue using the last system. They come up with something brand new.
Yeah, and that'll be
the One
because
Ring is the exception. Go ahead.
and 2D20 is Modiphius's game system as well, right? So they probably can't use it.
Right.
Well, although they might be able, because Modiphius did release an SRD OGL stuff for 2D20 now, so you can make your own 2D20 games now. Although it seems unlikely that they would choose to do that, except to tap into the already existing 2D20 market, and that more likely they would want to make their own system that is, you know, has some overlap with their stuff, right? Because that's part of why Modiphius does all these 2D20 games, is because they've got, you know, oh, you can play Dune and you can play Acton Cthulhu and you can play all of the different, you know, different settings that you like with a system that is fairly similar, so it's easy to get into, right?
I was curious about Conan because when Conan came along from the 2D20 system, I felt very much that there was almost a revival of that itself being done. You know, the whole idea of we're gathering the historians of Conan together and we're going to do this game, but also we're putting all together all this material that was probably quite disparate and perhaps a little bit arcane to get your head around. And I don't know, I'm not a massive, you know, fan of that particular literature. I haven't read a lot of it, but at the time I felt like this was almost like a resurgence of Conan came through the effort put into the game, and now I guess that the licensee gets to benefit from that, right, and sort of pass it on again. It's kind of an interesting thing.
It is, because they really did lean into the Howardian thing, right? With
it's Robert E. Howard's Conan game is part of there. And they didn't entirely uphold it. Probably they eventually realized that if you put all of the Howard Conan stories together, it's only like 1,000 pages of stories, which is, you know, not nothing, but in terms of actually like mining for stuff to put in an RPG is not necessarily enough to support like a 20 book line or however many it ended up being. So they were originally like, oh, we're not going to put anything non-Howardian in. And then they're like, well, we'll have some extra books that have some other, you know, some of the Elsprog de Camp stuff or some of Lovecraft's stuff or kind of some of the post-Howardian writers in, but, you know.
And we haven't talked about Lovecraft. We haven't talked about that.
No, but well, and that's a really interesting one because Call of Cthulhu has maintained its kind of consistency for so long, right? That it's not quite exactly the same game as it was when it first came out, but it's pretty close without any of the I think Pulp Cthulhu is probably the biggest difference, and it seems like that was a lot of people, I think, with earlier editions, from the sound of it, kind of played with their own attempt to make the sort of Pulp Cthulhu rules, and then Chaosium was eventually like, oh well, we'll just make our own book that has the official Pulp rules so that you don't have to come up with your own way to make your investigators not, you know, have bones made of glass and all that.
Yeah. Well, come on, let's be honest. I mean, Mike Mason writes Pulp Cthulhu so they can punch things and shoot things and run around. And so we can do sort of like, you know, 1940s and 1950s as well. That's all good fun. But I'm thinking about how, like, so Chaosum's got like the Call of Cthulhu, but actually all these other games that are, you know, taking the mythos. And I know that I've you know, comments have been made, I think, over the years about how, you know, some people are like trying to stick the Cthulhu label, stick them on something and it'll sell simply because it's so popular, be a bit cynical about it. But actually that is one property that really does inspire a broad base of gamers, isn't it? That idea of, you know, the horror element of the mythos, and that particularly despairing and I suppose nihilistic form of horror as well. It's really a strong vein in the hobby.
Well, and to talk about that kind of iterative development, I think Cthulhu is a great, or the sort of mythos horror, I guess we might say, is a great example of the way that some of that iterative development happens. Because, like, you know, Gumshoe originally seemed to be based on, you know, well, some people, when they run Call of Cthulhu, you just have to roll library signs over and over to get any clues. That's dumb. Just have them roll library signs to give them a hint of what the clue means. You know, why would you, if the clue is what progresses the story, why would you hide the clue from them? Just, you know, which is, but then there's also other, right? Because there's like Fate of Cthulhu, which is a very different beast in a lot of ways. It's kind of like the Terminator franchise-ish, where your characters are like coming back from the Cthulhu apocalypse to try to set it to right before it goes wrong, kind of thing. And And then there's other, I mean, there's like Cthulhu Dark, I think, is one of the really, really simple ones that is basically all just whatchamacallit, usage dice for, or maybe it's a different one that I'm thinking
Yeah,
of.
Cthulhu Dark is just it's a real simple one. It's just a basic, and there's no combat in there.
Well, and that's it. And that I think is a really interesting, it's kind of a great, like, you know, simplify the Call of Cthulhu concept all the way down, because Call of Cthulhu is basically just, you know, how long can you watch your sanity go down until your character is gone? So just, you know, you have your usage die, you have your lantern has so much oil and you have so much sanity, and, you know, you just kind of watch it go down over the course of the game, which is, I think, a really interesting kind of. Or even you have, I guess, Dread is not quite the same because it has some, but you could totally play. It's horror role playing, and for those who don't know, you play with a Jenga tower is the idea. And every time, basically, there's a sort of major event, you have to take a piece out of the Jenga tower, and then obviously there's only so many pieces you can take before the tower, right? You take all the middle pieces and build up, but then you eventually run out of middle pieces, and that's it. But the idea is that kind of, you know, it obviously only really works in person, but for that kind of tension of, you know, getting deeper and deeper into the mystery until something is going to fall apart. And I think the default is a little more kind of slasher horror for that one. But, you know, conceptually, that sort of totally fits in as very similar to the idea of like using the usage dice to just watch your stats go down. Is, you know, you're sort of watching the gradual tension get worse and worse until things fall apart.
Right. Now this is a divergent, but Che, have you seen that? I don't know how familiar you are with Dread. You've probably heard of it. That game with the Jenga tower that Arlen was mentioning. Do you guys know right now you can buy a Judge Dredd based on
Judge Dredd? Yeah, I saw that, which is pretty cool. Well, and there's some cool twists on that people have done. There's a solo game that's called, I don't remember the name. I'll have to, Wretched and Alone. And there's a whole number of Wretched games that are basically use a similar principle, that you have a Jenga tower, and the Wretched and Alone game is very much inspired by the movie Alien once Ripley is alone. And so the Jenga tower is basically every cycle, every day, or whatever it is. And then you also draw cards, and those determine kind of what happens and how many Jenga pieces you have to remove. And it's a sort of designed as a kind of journaling thing, where you're journaling your character's experiences as they're trying to survive against the alien horror that is lurking out there. And of course, the Jenga tower falling is you get got by the alien. But somebody maybe finds your voice recordings, right? Kind of classic sci-fi horror thing. Or maybe you get very, very lucky and are able to like repair the ship well enough to keep the defenses up to like go into light speed and leave the alien behind or something like that. I don't remember all of how it works, but it's kind of a similar concept, right? That you've got the physical tower basically to represent the kind of impending collapse, race against time type thing.
Right. It's an interesting mechanic that, I mean, sadly, it's not a good universal mechanic, because some people, if you have dexterity issues, or if you're
dexterity
online,
issues. Well, and also
like
you can't really play it online, which has become a huge part of the RPG sphere now. But you know,
but no, it's definitely interesting. Go ahead, Trey.
I was going to say, is this going to be another thing in like 20 years' time where we'll have a nostalgia for when we sat around tables and played these games together as well? And, you know, how we've evolved the games for VTT purposes and all the rest of it as well. You know, will we be looking back and thinking, oh, you know, wouldn't it be nice to play games like we used to in a room with dice?
Well, and there's an interesting way that I think one of the sort of unintended side effects of VTTs has to do with the way that there are certain kind of types of things you would do in a VTT that you probably wouldn't do in person. Especially, I think about, like, for instance, big battles, right? If you had to get like 200 goblin miniatures out for a battle, you probably wouldn't ever run a big battle in person with that many miniatures. But if on a VTT, it's just, you know, Control C, Control V, Control C, Control V, Control C, Control V to set up a whole bunch of them. And if you've got, you know, if you set up the health bars on Roll20 ahead of time, so everyone just gets its health bars, it's really, you know, you don't have to track your 100 goblins on your chart or anything like that, right? That you can totally do these things with this rule structure that without the technology would probably be pretty much, if not impossible, at least very, very unlikely that people would do these regularly.
Right. And one other interesting thing that I think VTTs do better than in person, although I definitely wouldn't advocate VT switching and not playing in person, but if you have the opportunity. But one thing VTTs do better is that secret information that where we used to be passing notes, because as much as the idea you're supposed to ignore the fact the other player handed the DM a note, you see the other player passing the DM a note, right? Where VTTs, you can send that direct message, private message.
Just a direct whisper or talk through Discord or something, all sorts of.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and there's some cool,
you don't have that.
I think there's even, especially depending on the VTT and depending on the complexity of the system, there's some really cool things you can do with the sort of automation of the digital tools. You talk about like something like Rolemaster, you can build. It's not as easy to do in something like Roll20, but I think in Fantasy Grounds it would be easier to do. But you could build essentially an automatic roll on the table function to essentially call a specific table so that you don't have to look up the specific table, which is not necessarily as much of a deal with Rolemaster in play, I think, as some people make it out to be, but it would definitely make it a little faster. And especially if you put all of those tables in ahead of time, you could, you'd have your bandits all have a different weapon and each of them uses a different kind of, critical table, as opposed to seems like normally what you do is you say, okay, well, they all have swords so that the GM only has to reference the one critical table.
Right.
And you're right, by the way. And by the way, I was going to say, you're right about Rolemaster. Fantasy Grounds has that for Rolemaster Classic, right? So, and I've played it. It is great. It just, hit, go, boom, you get the result. And it really does speed up the game. So yeah, that already is there if you're on the right platform, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. I was going to mention that too. So great catch, Che. And so that kind of support is out there. So there is, and there's no question that it does speed up a lot of that. Although, like Arlen said, to be fair, Rolemaster very much, people hear horror stories, but definitely go check it out, folks. Rolemaster is a front-loaded game. There's a lot of work up front, but in play, all that work up front makes it easier to play. It's kind of like Mutants and Masterminds, right? Masterminds is a ton of work up front, but it plays really easily.
I think I think a lot of games with that kind of structure really fill in that way. That it's uncommon to find a game where it's more work in play than it is to build a character. Seems like a sort of general, and that most games that have Mutants and Masterminds. I mean, Mutants and Masterminds is kind of similar to the way that Rolemaster has some tools to simplify down, but like Mutants and Masterminds, the deluxe core book has like a whole set of almost like random tables within kind of archetypes, so that you can be like, oh, well, if I would just want to play a brick, I'm going to roll a couple of dice and create a character who's big and tough and punches people and not have to do a whole bunch of math. And, Champions has something kind of similar going on with a lot of tools to make it easier to get into playing that game, even though if you wanted, you could, spend your 3 weeks doing tax forms to create the perfect Champions character. But,
Yeah.
Can I bring up one thing here, which is the nostalgia for the original? Can we just talk about that for a second as well? Because some things have been through these many iterations, and yet we have this real nostalgia for the original, which now, of course, for many games is immediately accessible. You can get a PDF, or someone will do either that, or someone will do a retro clone that's really close, right? So, what about that? Because some people just seem to go with a game and then they stay with that, and they want to go and play that thing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that at all, by the way. I'm just saying, is that a different element in this? We had this discussion about how things get brought back and and kind of updated and changing. But for a lot of gamers, the real joy of it is that I'm playing a game I played 4 years ago.
I'm that guy, right? So I'm in a bi-weekly AD&D first edition group where pretty much, not everything is rules written, but mostly play rules is written. I run Boot Hill second edition. I play in Boot Hill second edition, which second edition is basically the same as the first edition. I've just started up a Palladium Fantasy first edition game. So I'm that guy that goes back and plays, wants to play those old games. And
I will say I'm not really that guy, but I do understand a lot of not necessarily all of the attachment, but I do think that, I see it often in the case of, there's a game, seems like it's sort of often the most common progression is sort of like with Warhammer Fantasy role playing, where you have first edition that is ambitious and very flavorful, but harder to actually use and play, and then later editions that make it a lot easier to use and play, but often kind of take away some of the kind of unique flavor of that game from the original. And to me, that's where nostalgia for the original comes from. I mean, I think to use my example with the Riddle of Steel, the Riddle of Steel is a game that has a number of weird mechanical issues. They talk about the naked dwarf thing, which is where you can have a character who takes certain penalties and benefits to be a dwarf who is basically as tough without any armor as a character wearing like full knightly plate armor. Or there's also magic is just totally broken in that game. But at the same time, you also have things like the division between all of the different weapons skills is much more based on what's kind of like a flavorful interpretation of kind of 16th century medieval Europe compared to a lot of these other games that have sort of simplified it down to come across almost more like GURPS, for lack of a better term, that you have like, okay, well, swords work one way, but if you have like a hafted weapon like an axe or a mace, that works a different way. But we're not going to differentiate within those, right? A one-handed sword versus a two-handed sword versus a hafted weapon versus a pole arm. That's kind of our four. Versus like the Riddle of Steel. I think my favorite is the a brace of rapiers, I think is the term, which is a historical fighting style that did not exist for very long, but it's where you have two rapiers, one in each hand, which traditionally with a fencing weapon like that, you might fight with an offhand weapon, like have a dagger, a parrying dagger in your offhand, or you see sometimes the idea of you wrap like a piece of cloth, like a cape around your offhand, kind of, Three Musketeers style. But for a while in Italy, there was a school that was like, yeah, why not just have two of them? If one is good, two is better. And that's a total kind of flavorful thing that is not really brought into these later games, because they're like, this is just such nonsense, right? Like very, very few people historically fought like that. And it's just like, you're going to spend all of your points in one particular fighting style that doesn't even let you fight with one rapier very well. That doesn't make any sense, but it's fun and flavorful if you like that, kind of weirdness.
Right. To get back to, or not back to, but to answer Chase's question, maybe a little more directly from my point of view, definitely something like AD&D First Edition is a nostalgia thing. Like, as much as I love that edition, I'm not going to argue that the layout or even the rules of that game are superior to other games, or if you're going to have just one role-playing game, that should be the one to pick. But there are other older games like Boot Hill. I think for what Boot Hill does, Boot Hill Second Edition does it really, really well. And even your newest games, I mean, they might be laid out a little better or this or that, but really that rule set gets out of the way. It does what you need, and it does a really great job at it. Same thing like Cyberpunk 2020. The layout of that book now the book is laid out in a great way in that it sucks you in the world and teaches you the world, and it is really evokes the feeling in you and all that, but it's not laid out really well to find rules quickly. But the rules of Cyberpunk 2020 really work well, and I prefer it to Cyberpunk Red. I think that there were some missteps in the updating. So nostalgia is not always, using the older editions isn't always just a nostalgia thing. There sometimes is a practical thing, like where Boot Hill, it's simple and does work, but a lot of times it's just, I've always enjoyed the system, and I enjoy playing it. So,
I mean, you're gonna take the Palladium books out of my cold dead hands, but I'm going to play Palladium as a game system. But I tell you what, it's the game that introduced me to so many cool ideas that have never really been done quite as well anywhere else, especially in the magic and things like that. There's so many flavorful things, so many beautiful pieces of artwork as well as some really damn ropey ones, but are just entertaining. The whole thing, the whole flavor and the feel of it is just evokes 1980s because it's a product of that era. And I'm glad it's still in print. And it's just an awesome sort of set of properties, really. And yet, yeah, I doubt I'd really want to play that game system because it's so clunky and old and everything else, But I worry that if, Kevin Symbiota probably would never update it, But if he did, would you lose something? Probably. There's always that trade-off, isn't there? When you try and make the system slicker, sometimes you have to take away some of the things that made the whole thing kind of exciting. And I mean, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition has that, so much edginess to the whole setting and the whole thing. And then when you're playing through, but of course, the second edition and now on through to the fourth edition, you could argue that that's a more polished game system. But I would argue that it's lost something of the edginess, that sort of punk, early 80s, mid 80s kind of feel.
Yeah. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time. Folks, if you're listening to this, you look in the show notes, there's all the ways to contact us. Reach out, tell us what you think, and maybe if you have nostalgia games that you still play because you played it back in the day, or you have like Chase talked about with Warhammer, where first edition Warhammer just evokes something in you compared to the newer editions. Let us know. We'll play your call in the air. We'll read your comment out loud if you send it to us and give you feedback. We'd love to have that. But guys, before we go, I'll let you get some last thoughts in here. I think we opened with Chase, so I'll let Arlen do the first last thought. Go ahead.
Is there a specific topic, or just say whatever?
Oh no, we're just closing out. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, I think nostalgia. I think it can be easy for a comment about nostalgia to come across as like a criticism, right? That, well, you're only playing that game because you're nostalgic for it. And I think that that's not necessarily the best way to think about it. That, if you're playing games to have fun, there's nothing wrong with having fun because you're nostalgic for something. I do think there is sometimes some people who have unacknowledged nostalgia will say like, oh, this system that I played when I was 8 to when I was 12 is definitely the best RPG system ever made. And it's like, well, I think it might have more to do with fond memories when you were, a 10-year-old. But I think it's totally fine to, all of us have things that we enjoy for all sorts of number of reasons, and nostalgia is one of them. I think it's like a lot of things worth recognizing, but not necessarily a terrible thing. It's fine to be nostalgic for stuff that you love, or, have attachments to things that come from that sort of, in the same way, I think about like, movies that I really loved as a kid that, opening up, I probably will never run a long campaign of Decipher's Lord of the Rings game, because I think that it is not horrible, but just not really I don't see why I would run it instead of the One Ring for almost anything that I wanted to do. But looking at like all of the stills from the Fellowship of the Ring, which, I've watched the Peter Jackson versions of those movies so many times, is like, oh man, I really, this is really cool to see like, the Council of Elrond sitting around at Rivendell again after, coming back to it and all that. And I think that's, it's fine. Everybody has things they like. Why not? Just acknowledge it instead of suggesting that AD&D First Edition with the Wilderness Survival Guide and the Dungeoneer's Guide are definitely better than any other D&D that has ever been published.
I think I'd like to build on that. I should say that, nostalgia is a feeling that's evoked. And I mean, I hinted on this, we're talking about Palladium, but if I look at the Palladium books, there's a nostalgia it's the feeling I had when I was about, 14 or 15, playing that game and mucking about with that game, that's what gets evoked. And on a sort of logical level, no, that isn't a great game. But actually, it doesn't matter because it's the feeling evoked to me. And I discovered the other day, I talked about the D20 era a while ago, but, that was a resurgence for me in coming back to the hobby and being able to play with a group for the first time in years and years. And that era, again, I looked at a few games the other day, and again, it evoked memories of really great sessions, of really great things, the really good times that we'd had, and made me want to go dig into those books again, go and look at the PDF or something. And I would encourage people to do that, because I think that there's a richness we forget. We forget so many great experiences that we've had, and just sometimes pingling through our enormous PDF catalog that we have is a great thing to do, just to evoke memories, maybe trigger a few ideas, something that you maybe can dig out from the past and put into a new game with a completely different system from where you got it from. But, it can evoke so much richness for you. I don't think we should be afraid of it. I think actually embracing that and saying, yeah, I'm doing this, I'm putting this in my adventure because it's really cool. And it was really cool when I was 16 and it's still really cool today. That's a good thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah. Proustian RPGing.
Yeah.
Serve tea and Madeleine cookies.
Yeah, I think the key with nostalgia is just go with it, with open eyes. And there's nothing wrong with embracing what you loved back then. Just recognize that, just be willing to admit maybe not everything's perfect with it, and be willing to be open to the flaws. Like, I never saw the flaws in the layout for like Cyberpunk 2020 or even Palladium books back when I played them in the 80s and 90s. But nowadays, with doing this Palladium Fantasy First Edition campaign, the flaws in the layout have become very apparent, especially when you're looking through PDFs. Some players look through PDFs trying to find things compared to be able to flip through a real book, or D&D, First Edition AD&D, where the rules are spread across multiple books. It's obvious that some of the problems with that, so you have to admit what the problems are with something. Also potentially with content things and all too. I mean, obviously, but gentlemen, I really appreciate your coming on today. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I definitely appreciate the thoughts and this great conversation we've had.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. So, but again, folks, reach out, let us know what you think. You can find these guys on their own channels, on their own podcasts or YouTubes or different social medias. I'll have links in the show notes for all ways to contact them. The last thing I'll do before we go, is there anything left that you want to plug there, Che?
Plug?
Yeah.
No, not really.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair.
I think it's fine. Just actually, Rolemaster Unified. Go on.
I will mention, because we talked about the new version of Space 1889, and I don't know if the Kickstarter will still be going when this publishes. I doubt it. But I would feel remiss if I didn't mention that the company that is doing the new version of Space 1889, one of the main people involved is J.M. DeFoggy, who I have interviewed for my YouTube channel and podcast before, and is a really great guy. Did the Jackals RPG that is published by Osprey that now has a couple of supplemental books also with it. But he's a really cool dude, and it's totally worth supporting his games because I'm sure it is going to be good.
Yeah. Sadly, that there's 8 days to go, so this will not be out. At time of recording, there's 8 days to go. But
you can get Space 1889 once it releases fully, I guess.
Right, and I will put a link to the Kickstarter in the show notes, folks. So if you go there, a lot of times there'll be late pledges, or you'll be able to follow the progress of the project. Mm-hmm. So I will put that in there. And with that, I don't have anything to plug other than check out these gentlemen's work. And this is coming out on the 23rd of December. So I'm going to wish everybody a happy Western Christmas or happy holidays, or, whatever it is that you guys celebrate. I hope you're able to spend time with family and friends this year. And we'll talk to you next time. Take care, folks.
A Nerd Central broadcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the sign of Abstract. The all stars and pods past, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Something's brain teeth, or suicide in your brain. Baby, what I mean is this exchange of fake ephemeral. I understand don't look now, the Super is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can bring it, you can hide, I'll think about in any order. Just another brain of legal toss us running for the border. Just a snack like a one master. Here and here, stories printed buzz. You can eat on a baby, and his dust is never faded. It's savoring the flavor of the movies it created.